Somatic sensations arise from stimulation of sensory receptors that are embedded in the skin or in the subcutaneous layer. Remember back when we learned all the layers of the skin, you had the epidermis, the dermis, and then the subcutaneous layer was that fatty layer underneath the skin. So these sensory receptors may also be located in mucous membranes of the mouth, vagina, and anus, in skeletal muscles, tendons, and joints. So these sensory receptors for somatic sensation are very unevenly distributed. So some areas of the body have a very dense population of receptors, and other areas of the body have relatively few of these receptors. The areas with the highest density of somatosensory receptors are the tip of the tongue, the lips, and the fingertips. Somatic sensations that arise from stimulating the skin are cutaneous sensation. Remember, the skin is the cutaneous membrane. And there are 4 modalities or types of somatic sensation: tactile, thermal, pain, and proprioceptive. Tactile sensations include touch, pressure, vibration, itch, and tickle. Thermal sensations, of course, are detected by thermoreceptors. Cold receptors detect a decrease in temperature. Warm receptors are not quite as abundant as cold, but they're located in the skin as well, and they detect those increases in temperature. We have receptors for pain. Pain is a necessary protective function that allows us to sense when something has the potential to damage our body, to damage our tissues. Nociceptors are the receptors for pain. That's Nociceptors. Need that again? Nociceptors. So nociceptors, the receptors for pain, are free nerve endings, and they're found in every tissue of the body except for the brain. This is why you sometimes see brain surgeries being done on patients that are conscious. Your organs also have nociceptors that detect visceral pain. Visceral pain is felt in or just deep to the skin that overlies the stimulated organ, or in a surface area that may be far from that stimulated organ. So if you are detecting pain that is not near the organ, that is called referred pain. So let's look at that on the next slide. Let me go ahead right quick and give you some information about proprioceptors while we're here. Proprioceptors allow us to recognize that parts of our body belongs to us, so recognize self structures. It also allows us to know where our head and limbs are located and how they're moving, even if we're not looking at them to see where they are. This allows us to do the movements that we do every day, such as walk or type or put our clothes on, without using our eyes. Okay, so now let's move into that content that I mentioned just a minute ago, a little bit prematurely, and that is the concept of referred pain. So sometimes when you have a pain in an organ, you will also feel pain in another part of the body. This phenomenon is called referred pain. So the visceral organ involved and the area in which you feel the pain that is not near that organ, of course, are both going to be served by the same segment of the spinal cord. For example, the sensory fibers from the heart, the skin that is superficial to the heart, and the skin along the left arm, all is innervated by the same part of the spinal cord. So pain in the heart can be felt in all of those areas. So in this image, you can see the red areas of the upper left part of the chest, where the majority of the heart would be located, as well as down that left arm. The areas in red show the areas of referred pain. You can also see here in green on both the anterior and posterior view. These green areas, you may feel referred pain from the lungs and the diaphragm, because the spinal nerve that innervates the lungs and the diaphragm of course, innervate that same area of the neck and upper part of the shoulder here. Now remember, all this different stimuli we just talked about, the tactile sensations, the thermal, the pain, and the proprioceptors, were all types of stimulation of sensory receptors in the skin, the mucous membranes, the skeletal muscles, and structures associated with the muscles. So that is what we call somatic sensory, right? So when those receptors are stimulated, then the somatosensory pathways relay information from the somatosensory receptors to the primary somatosensory area in the parietal lobe of the cerebral cortex and to the cerebellum. So this is getting that sensory information into the somatosensory area of the brain, okay? So if you notice this funny little man in this particular image, that is what we call a homunculus. So specific areas of the cerebral cortex receive somatosensory input from particular areas of the body. Other areas of the cerebral cortex provide output in the form of instructions for movement of particular parts of the body. So right now we're looking at that sensory information. So the somatic sensory map, and then in a few minutes we'll see the somatic motor map, relates these parts of the bodies to the area of the cortex where that information is brought in and processed. So if you look at this little man, again we call him a homunculus. That means little man. You'll see that some of the body parts, for instance the lips, the face, the tongue, and the hands, have a very, very large image of this strange looking little man. Well, that is indicating how much of the cerebral cortex is relating to the sensory input coming from those areas of the body. So remember, you have a lot of sensory receptors in the face, the tongue, the lips, and the hands. So a much larger part of the cerebral cortex is associated with those. So you see a very large face with really, really big lips and very large hand. Once that somatosensory information is brought into the brain and processed in some of the association areas, if an action is to occur or a movement is to be generated, the premotor and primary motor areas of the brain are going to control those muscles. Now remember, sensory brings information in, association and processing areas, integration areas, make sense of it and determine if an action is to occur, and then motor pathways will cause an action to occur, such as skeletal muscle contraction. So we see here, just like we saw with the somatosensory map of the brain with the homunculus, we also see the same thing with the primary motor area. So each point within the area controls certain muscle fibers in a different part of the body. So different muscles are represented unequally in the primary motor area, just like we saw the sensory areas were associated differently as well. So the cortical area has more area devoted to those areas where you have muscles involved in very skilled, complex, or delicate movements. The muscles in the thumb, the fingers, the lips, the tongue, and the vocal cords have very large representations here on the homunculus, whereas the trunk of the body has a much, much smaller area. So you can see, again, it's a little bit different than it was when we were looking at the primary sensory or the somatosensory pathway. And again, remember, the homunculus is just a distorted image of how much of the brain is related to that particular part of the body, whether it is sensory or motor. All right, let's review what we've covered. Let's keep this pretty simple here. So nerve impulses for most of our somatic sensations, tactile, temperature, pain, and proprioception, are going to ascend to the cerebral cortex. Specific areas of the primary somatosensory area of the cortex receive somatosensory information or input from different areas of the brain, as we saw when we looked at that first image of the homunculus. There are also pathways to the cerebellum that transmit impulses for subconscious proprioception, from the trunk and the lower limbs. So we'll look at that in just a moment. So far we're getting information into the cortex. So that's sensory information to the cortex and also a little bit to the cerebellum, just to make sure we're sort of standing in the right position and our body is upright. So aware of our position. The primary motor area of the cortex is a major control region for executing those voluntary movements. But the cerebellum also contributes to that movement. So let's look just briefly at the role of the cerebellum here. So in addition to maintaining proper posture and balance, the cerebellum is active in both learning and performing rapid and coordinated and very highly skilled movements, such as what it takes to swing a tennis racket and hit a ball or a golf club, or speaking, swimming, riding a bicycle. So in order to do so, first the cerebellum has to monitor your intentions for movement. So it receives impulses from the motor cortex and some of the nuclei within the brain regarding what movements we're planning to do. Pretty complicated, huh? Then the cerebellum monitors what those actual movements are. So what's actually happening? Then the cerebellum compares the command to the sensory input. So the cerebellum compares what our intentions for movement were with the actual movement that we did and corrects it when it's wrong. So sends out corrective feedback. So over longer periods of time, it also helps us to contribute to the learning of new motor skills by sending out those corrective signals. So skilled activities, as I mentioned a while ago, like tennis or volleyball or golf, are good examples of the contribution of the cerebellum to these repetitive type movements. So think about what all you have to learn and what all has to be accomplished before you hit a ball. How do you know you're going to make contact? How do you stop at the right point? Even before you hit the ball, the cerebellum has sent nerve impulses to the cerebral cortex, informing them of where to swing and where your swing has to stop. So all of this is controlled by the cerebellum.